Hello friends. So in this session we are going to discuss about variable. What is variable, how it is useful for the application, and how we can declare or how we can reserve the memory in the application. So let's talk about variable. So when we use any data in the application, in the program, the data will be stored in the memory, in the primary memory. And this data will be stored in the memory during the execution of the program. So when we execute our application, the memory will be allocated and the data will be stored inside that memory. Now to store or access the value inside the memory, we need to identify that memory block. So when the program is in execution, there is a memory allocated and we need to identify that memory block. How will you identify that? To identify that memory, we are providing some name for that memory block. So if you want to identify the memory from the primary memory where our data is stored, then we need to provide some name. That name is nothing but variable. So what is a variable? Variable is the name of memory block which holds the data that is provided by the user or the data that is used inside the application. Now always the memory is allocated while executing the program. It's not like when you write the code, the memory is allocated, or when you compile the code, the memory is allocated. Always the memory will be allocated during the program execution, and you can identify that memory with the name provided, that is with the variable name. Now when you have the value inside the variable, you can change this value during the execution of program. You can change this value a number of times during the execution of the program. Now, when you think about reserving the memory, when you think about allocating the memory, how can you allocate that? How can you reserve that? So to reserve the memory, we need to specify the size of the memory. One is the size of the memory and the other is the type of value that is stored inside that type of value. So how much memory block required and what type of data you are going to store inside that. And if you remember the data type topic, the data type is used for identification of the size and the type of the value. So we will use data type to reserve the memory, or you can say to reserve the memory and to provide some name for that memory, that is to declare the variable, to define the variable. So how you are going to use that? So the syntax is you are going to use the data type, you are going to give the name of the type, what type of data you are going to store inside that memory, and depending on the data type, the size will be allocated. And also you are going to give the name for the memory block, that is called as variable name. So this is the syntax we are going to follow to reserve the memory. First data type and then the name of the variable. Now depending on the data type, if you remember the data type concept, there are two types of data type that we have discussed. One is the primitive data type, another is user defined data type. Primitive, we have 8 data type. The basic 8 data type are the primitive data type, and then we have the user defined data type like a class or maybe interface or some enum or some annotations, array. These are the user defined data type. So if you think the category of the variable, based on the data type, we have two types of variable. One is primitive variable and other is reference variable. So primitive variable is that is declared, that is defined with the primitive data type, and reference variable is that is declared with the user defined data type. So think about this primitive variable. So primitive variable are the variables that is declared with primitive data type. Those variables are called as primitive variables. On the other hand, the reference variable, the variables are declared with a reference data type, or that is also called as user defined data type. So other than primitive, whatever variable you are defining is called as a reference variable. If you are using the data type is primitive, then those variables are called as primitive variable. If not, other than primitive type, all will be considered as the reference variable. Now for the primitive variable, memory will be allocated depending on the data type. Like if you remember the concept of data type, we have seen that for the byte, 1 byte memory is required. For the char, 2 byte memory is required. For the sort, 2 byte memory is required. For the int, 4 byte memory. For the long, 8 byte memory. And for the reference, always 8 byte memory. So if you declare a variable with the primitive data type, then depending on the data type, the size will be allocated. The memory blocks size will be allocated. But for the reference, always 8 byte memory will be allocated. It is fixed. Other than primitive, if you declare any variable, always 8 byte memory will be allocated. Now there is a concept of a default value in the Java programming language. So for the primitive variable, the default value will be depending on the primitive data type. But for the reference, always default value will be null. You can say in the memory, the default value is always 0. All the bits will be filled with 0. Every bits will be 0. That is default value. In the case of primitive, it is represented as 0 in the numeric, or maybe in the boolean it is false. In the character it is kind of 0, ASCII value 0, Unicode 0. But in the reference, we cannot represent 0. So they have given the special value called null. Null means nothing is there. Nothing is there inside that allocated memory. It is 0 bit. Next, primitive variable holds the value or the literals of the corresponding type, and it holds the actual value. Primitive variable holds the actual value inside the memory. What reference variable holds? It is not holding the actual value. It holds either null in the case of nothing or default, or address of an object, or you can say address of other data. So reference variable holds the address of a different value that is called as object. But primitive holds the actual value. We will see how it is. We will see with the diagram or with the concept how it is. But this is the primitive and the reference variable concept. Now, since we have seen that based on the data type, two types of variable can be considered. One is primitive variable, another is a reference variable. Now, think about where you are defining the variable. So, based on a scope, where you are defining this variable, depending on that, there are three types of variable that can be considered. One is called as static variable, another is called as instance variable, and then the third one is called as local variable. So based on the scope means where it is declared. Based on the scope, we have three types of variable. One is static, another is instance, and the third one is local variable. Two types of variable based on the data type, and three types of variable based on the scope. But it's not like totally you have five types of variable. You can have a combination based on the data type with based on the scope. Means you can say I can have a static primitive variable. You can say that I have static reference variable. So a static depending on the scope, but to declare the actual variable, you must have to use the data type. So a static can be primitive or can be reference. Similarly, instance can be primitive or can be reference. So B can have instance primitive variable or instance reference variable. Similarly, we can have local primitive variable or local reference variable. We will see more in details with the program, with the application, that how these all can be defined or where these all can be defined. But for now, we are just talking about the types of variable. So how to declare the variable? That is data type and the variable name. Now, what is the data type you are using? Depending on that, there are two types of variable, primitive and the reference, and where you are defining the variable. Depending on that, there are three types of variable, static, instance, and local. So static can be primitive or reference, instance can be primitive or reference, or local also can be primitive or reference. So any combination can be possible. This is about the basic concept of variable. Now we will think about variable, how the memory will be allocated and all those things. So let's talk about that. So let's just say we are defining a variable of primitive type using the primitive data type. So how it happens? Let's just say we are using the data type called int and the name of the variable called value. So this is the statement we are using to declare the variable or to reserve the memory inside the variable. Now what will happen with this? When we have the statement called int value, what is happening inside the memory? So inside the memory, one block will be allocated. What is the size of the block? It depends on the type of the variable. So we have used a type called int, and because of that, the type will be used as int and the size of this block will be 4 byte. So there is a memory allocated of 4 byte and the name of that memory will be used as value. The name of the memory is provided as value. What this memory block holds, what this memory block stores? It stores the actual value 0. 0 is the default value for the int type. So it stores the actual value, that is 0. So in the case of bit representation, you can say, so total 32-bit memory is allocated and all the bits value are 0. So we have total 32-bit memory and all the bits is filled with 0. This is the default value. This is how we are going to allocate the memory. What if you don't want this 0 value? You want other than 0 value. We have other options. While defining the variable, when you say int count, you can provide the initial value as well. Int count equal to 23. In this case, what will happen? Since we are using the type as int, a memory block will be allocated that is of 4 byte. Name of that memory block will be count and inside this the 23 value will be stored. So in the bit representation, now if you think we have total 32 bit of memory where the value 23 will be stored in the binary. So this is the value for the 23. So B can have either the default value if you are not providing any value. If you provide the initial value, then the initial value will be stored inside your memory block. This is for the primitive type, primitive variable. Now what in the case of reference? Think about this. So in the case of reference, let's say we say called a string. String is a defined type, predefined type in Java. We are using the example of a string. So I say a string email. I want to store the email. A string is combination of characters. So we are using string. A string email. What will happen? The process remains the same. The memory block will be allocated. But what is the size of this memory block? A string, what is the type? Yes, it is a type, but it is not the primitive type. A string is not listed in the primitive type. So if it is not the primitive type, it is a reference type. And if it is a reference type, then always 8-byte memory will be allocated. 8-byte memory will be allocated for the reference variable. And the name of that memory block is given as email. What it holds the null. So how the null can be stored inside the memory? It is basically there are 64 bits allocated with all the bits as 0. So in you can think that in the case of reference, when nothing is available inside that, it is representing all the bits as 0, and that is considered as null in the Java programming language. Null means nothing is available inside that. It is holding, it is empty reference, nothing is there inside that, and all the bits are 0. Now what if you are having some value? I am saying a string name equal to Adi. So in this case, we are going to allocate the memory. The memory size will be of 8-byte because of the reference type. The name of this memory block is name, and it holds what it holds. If we remember, in the case of reference, it does not hold the actual value. It holds the reference of the object. It holds the address of the object. So in this case, the value we are giving called Adi. Now Adi will not be stored directly inside the name. Somewhere else, the Adi object will be stored. The data will be stored. So let's say somewhere else the data is stored, and that location, the memory location is 39723. Now assume that this is the location 39723 is the location where your data Adi is stored. Now that address will be stored inside your name variable. This is the concept of reference. So primitive stores the actual value, whereas the reference stores the address of the object. So in the bits, you have some bits pattern with 0 and 1 that is not holding the actual value, but that is holding the address of the object. So this is the representation, memory representation in the case of primitive and the reference. So what happens? In the case of primitive, the actual value will be stored inside the allocated memory, whereas in the case of reference, it holds either null or the address of the object. This is the primitive and the reference. So what we discussed about primitive and reference? Any variable you declared with primitive data type called as primitive variable, whereas if you are using the data type as reference or the user defined type called as reference variable. Memory will be allocated depending on the primitive type, whereas for the reference, always the 8-byte memory will be allocated. For the primitive, the default value depends on the primitive data type, but for the reference, the default value will be null. In human readable format, it is null. Inside the memory, everything is 0 in the case of default value. Primitive variable holds the actual data, whereas a reference variable holds either the null or the address of the object. This is primitive and the reference variable. Now we have seen, depending on the scope, we have three types of variable: the static, instance, and the local. So what does it mean? If let's say we are going to write some program. So I'm saying class a test, and inside that we are having the syntax. We will talk about all these things in details, but for now, to run the application, this is the minimum requirement that we are going to have. So we are having public static void main, a string, bracket, and some arguments, args. Now think about the scope. static, instance, and the local. So what is a static? If you define a variable in the class, if you define a variable inside the class directly, I am saying int and then say A. A is the name of the variable. So I am defining a variable inside the class directly, but with that I am using one keyword called static. So if you define a variable inside the class directly by using the static keyword, then it is called as static variable. Next, I am defining again another variable, a string, and then say str. So these two are the static variable. The variable declared inside the class with a static modifier with a static keyword is called as a static variable. Now think about this. When I say int a, since we used static, so it is a static variable, and the data type we have used as primitive, so it is primitive variable. So it is a static and primitive. Similarly, when we think about a second variable, a static, but the type we have used, that is a string, it is actually a reference. So we say it is as a reference variable. This is called a static variable. We can define with primitive data type or we can define with a reference data type. So a static primitive variable, a static reference variable. Overall, a static variable. Next, instance variable. We can define a variable inside the class, but we can ignore the static keyword. We are not using static keyword. So if you define a variable inside the class without using a static keyword, you are not using a static keyword, then it is called as instance variable. And since we are using the data type as primitive, so it is called as primitive variable. Instance primitive variable. Similarly, we can use reference type as well. So I am using say a string str2. We are defining the variable inside the class, but we are not using a static keyword. So if you define a variable inside the class with a static, it is called as a static variable. If you define variable inside the class without a static, it is called as instance variable. Data type you are using, if it is primitive, you say primitive variable. If it is reference, you say it is the reference variable. Now we have a local variable. So if you declare a variable inside the member of the class, like class test and public static void main is the member of the class. So when we are defining a variable in the class with a static, it is called as a static. Without a static, it is called as instance. And inside the member of the class, then it is called as local variable. This is called as local variable. Now this also can be primitive or can be a reference. I am saying a string name. So local variable, but if it is primitive type, it is local primitive variable, and if it is reference type, then it is local reference variable. So depending on the scope, you have three types of variable: the static, instance, and the local. For the local, you will not be able to use the static modifier, the static keyword. It will give you the compilation error. Why? All those things we will talk details in the static topic. But for now, how can you declare the variable and what are the options you have? So we have a static variable. It can be primitive or reference. We have instance variable. It can be primitive or reference. And we have local variable. It is local. There is no static or instance for the local. Those three are three different scopes. So depending on the data type, we have primitive and the reference variable. Depending on the scope, we have a static, instance, and the local variable. So these are the options we have to define the variable. Now let's talk about the program. First we will see, like in the concept of data type, we discussed there is a concept of default value, a default value for the variable. Now remember the point that the default value will be only allocated or only provided for the static or instance variable. The default value will be only provided for the static or instance variable. There is no default value for the local variable. Default value will be only provided for static and instance variable, not for the local variable. Let's verify this. Let's test this. So let's come to the code. Say I'm creating a new file called test. The file name should be test.java. So I'm creating a file called test.java. It's a Java file. We are going to write some code. Say I'm writing a class called a test, and inside this we are defining the predefined member, a predefined signature. Public static void main. This is your main method, starting point of the application. Now think about a default value. Suppose I want to say I have a variable called value. The type of that variable is int, and I want to print this value. I want to see what is the data available inside this. So this is the program that we have written. Now let's compile this. So I'm going to compile this program. So the code we have, that is this, and we are going to compile this program. If you remember, we have discussed how to install Java and how to set the path for accessing the compiler. If not, just refer the corresponding topic. So now I am going to compile Java C and then test.java. It is saying variable value might not have been initialized. It is saying that you are trying to use the data of this value, but this value is not initialized. There is no data available inside this value. So for the local variable, there is no concept of default value. Default value will not be provided for the local variable. Now verify with the static variable. Let's say I'm defining a static int value. From the local scope, I moved that to static scope. Now I am trying to compile this. It's compiling successfully. It is not giving any error. So for the local, we don't have the default value, but for the static, we have the default value. What is that default value? Let's verify. Java and a test. It is giving a 0. For the int, the default value is 0. Let's verify with other data type. So I'm checking with all the types. I'm just verifying what is the default value for all the data types. So let's verify. I'm saying a static, boolean, option, or say I'm saying boolean b1, static, byte, b by 1, static, int, value, static, say I'm talking about sort, s, static, long, some data, static, float, some f1, static, double, some d1, static, a string I am using for the reference, some str. So be a declared variable of a different type. We are not providing any value, so it contains the default value. Since it is static, it contains the default value. Now just print all the data. In the same order I am printing b1, that is for boolean, then byte, then int we have, after int we have sort, after sort we have long, after long we have float, then we have double, and then we have string. So B declared a variable of boolean type, byte type, int type, sort type, long type, float type, double type, and a string type. We declared a variable of various data type. Now I'm trying to print the value of this inside the main. We saved this file. Now just compile this. There is no compilation error. Let's execute this. Now verify the value. We discussed about the default value. For the boolean, the default value is false. For the byte, the default value is 0. For the int, the default value is 0. For the sort and long, default values are 0. For the float and double, it's 0.0. And for the reference, the default value is null. This is the default value provided. Think about instance variable. I'm just removing the static modifier, static keyword from the variable. So if you declare a variable inside a class, but if you are not using the static keyword, these are called as instance variable. Now just I'm compiling this. Let's verify this. What happens? When I compile this, you see n number of error messages for each variable saying non-static variable. Non-static variable. B1 is not the static variable and it cannot be referred from the static context. If you see for the main, we are using a static. So if you are having a static variable, you can access directly inside the main. But if you are not using a static variable, that is non-static or instance variable, non-static and instance both are same. This is just a synonyms. So non-static or instance, if you are using non-static variable, then it cannot be referred directly from the static. If it is non-static variable, it cannot be referred directly from the static. So static can be accessed directly, but non-static cannot be accessed. So how do we see the default value for this? Let's write some other piece of code. We'll discuss more on these topics, but let's verify. I am saying void show. This show is going to show the value of each variables. So I have instance variable declared. Then we have a method to print all the value, and this method we are going to call from the main. This all topic will be discussed. I am saying test t equal to new test and then t dot show. This show is going to display all the value. What I am writing, you don't think about that. Just consider about the default value concept. That for the instance, do we have default value or not? We have seen that for the local, there is no default value. For the static, there are default values. So I'm talking about the instance now, non-static. Let's compile this. So if you see boolean b1, it is not a static, and so this is also not a static. So there is no problem. But when you remember, When we tried accessing from the static main method, it was giving the error. So non-static variables cannot be referred from the static. It can only be accessed from the non-static. Now let's execute this. You can see the default value for the boolean, for the byte, short, int, long, float, double, and the reference, the string. So this is the concept of default value. There are the default value for each data type. Depending on the data type, the default value available, and the default value will be provided only for a static and the instance, that is non-static. For the local, there is no concept of default value. How you are accessing, we'll talk about that. Now in this we have not used character type. Let's verify for the character. And just for easy, I'm using static concept. So I'm defining a variable called char. The variable name is, say, xby. Now trying to print this. Now if you see, I'm trying to print this xy. Let's verify what it is printing. I don't see any value on this output console. So does xy has the default value? Does the character type has the default value? Let's verify. I'm comparing what is available inside this xy. Is it 0? What is available inside the xy? Is it /u0000? This is the Unicode for the 0 value. So I'm just verifying. Is the default value for character type, that is xby, the memory allocated for the xby is holding some value, default value. What is that default value? I'm comparing with the ASCII 0 and I'm comparing with the Unicode /u0000. Now let's verify this. Yes, both are saying true. So for the character, the memory is allocated of 2 byte. All the bits are 0, and for 0 there is no character representation. So it is not printing anything. But we have the value inside the xby, that is 0. You can say 0 in the form of ASCII or /u00 in the form of Unicode. But actually the value 0 is available inside the xy. So we have the default value for char data type also. That is either in the form of ASCII or in the form of Unicode. So this is how the default value can be displayed. So for the static, for the instance, we have the default value, but for the local, we don't have the default value. Now, there are a different concept. How can you declare the variable? How can you allocate the memory for the variable? So let's verify that. I am saying int a. This is one option we have seen to declare the variable. Now, just I am verifying. What is the value inside this a? And we have seen that for the local variable, we will not be having the default value. But this is a way to declare the variable. You can declare multiple variable of this type, of one type or maybe other type. Let's say another variable I want to declare called name of a string type. Another variable I want to declare of boolean type called b1. So we will be able to declare variable. If you don't print this, that's fine, no problem. But the issue is when we are trying to use the local variable that is not having any value, not having default value also. So this is one way to declare variables. Now how to provide the value inside this? Let's say a equal to 12. Name equal to providing the value Adi. Say B1 equal to true. I'm giving values inside the variable. I'm providing values inside the declared variable, allocated memory, and then trying to print the value. What is inside A, what is inside name, and what is inside B1. Let's verify. I compiled this and then I executed. So inside the A, the value 12 is available. Inside the name, the value Adi is available. Inside the B1, the value true is available. So this is how you can declare the variable, and this is how you can store the value inside the variable. You can provide some value inside the variable. Now these two statements can be combined in a single statement also. A equal to 12, name equal to Adi, and then B1 equal to true. So if you have the requirement, you can declare and initialize in the single statement also. Now let's verify this. Yes, we are able to declare and initialize in the single statement. So you can do in the different statement or you can do in the single statement. Now, can we declare multiple variable in one statement? Let's try. We can say A, B, C. Say I am saying a string name email. Can we declare more than one variable of one type in one statement? I'm just defining. I'm not providing the value. I'm just defining the value. Let's verify. Compile this. It is not giving any error. Means yes, we can. How can you provide the value? Can we provide the value for all these variables? Yes, one option is A equal to 12, B equal to 13, C equal to 14. Let's say ABC has the value. Name equal to, I'm giving some name. Email equal to, I'm giving some email. Some email value. So we declared multiple variable of one type in one statement for int and for the string. Now we provided some value and trying to print the value, trying to get the value of that variable. I am printing A, printing B, printing the value of C, then printing the value of name, and then printing the value of email. Let's verify. Compile this. Compiled successfully. Execute this. It is printing all the values. So we can declare multiple variable of same type in a single statement and then we can initialize that separately. Can we initialize in one statement? Can be declared multiple variable in one statement and then initialize in the other statement at a time? Yes. If the variable is already declared, we can do the association but with the same value. I can say A, B, C equal to 12. Similarly, for the string, for the reference type also, name equal to email equal to, let's say I'm giving the value as Adi. So first we declared multiple variable of one type in one statement and then initializing all those variable or the required variable with same value in a single statement. Let's try this. For the ABC, we have 12 value and for the name and email, we have same value. So you can declare multiple variable of same type in a single statement and then you can initialize. But can we declare and initialize both in the single statement? Let's try this. So I'm saying A equals to 12, comma, B equals to 13, comma, C equals to 14. Similarly, name equal to Adi, comma, email equal to adi@gmail.com. So we are trying to declare and initialize multiple variable in a single statement. You can do with the comma separation. Let's verify this. Yes, we have A with the 12, B with 13 and C with 14. String name Adi, comma, email equal to some values, and we are able to use this. So these are the concept that we have to declare and initialize the variable. But there are limitations. Like if you think I have int A already declared, then I'm saying int B equal to maybe 12, comma, A equal to 13. If I say like this, whenever you are using the data type at the starting, it will assume that you are going to reserve a memory, and A memory is already reserved in the first statement. So let's verify this. So if I try to compile this, it is saying variable A is already defined inside this main method. So in one scope, you cannot declare two variables with the same name. In one scope, you cannot declare two variables with the same name. It is already declared, so you cannot declare again. But yes, you can initialize. I can say int b equal to A and equal to 13. Let's verify this. It's fine, no problem. Now B and A both has the 13 value. So if it is already declared, you cannot separate with comma in the next declaration. It will be assigning the value, not redeclaration. Again, you cannot declare multiple variable of different data type. Like I am saying byte B, int A, comma byte B. Let's try to verify this. This is invalid. So you can declare, there are multiple options available. You can declare one variable in one statement. You can declare multiple variable in one statement of any type. Any type means one type only. Int means all the variables should be of int type. A string means all the variable will be of a string type. Maybe you can declare and initialize the value one variable, or you can declare and initialize multiple variables. Something like this. So one variable or multiple variable. If the variable is already declared, you can initialize in the separate line, or you can initialize in the same line as well with the same value. So any of the option you can use to declare the variable and to store the value inside the variable. This is how the variable is. This is how the variable can be declared. So we discussed about the primitive and the reference variable and the static instance and the local variable. More about a static instance local will be discussed in the later session, but this is for the basic concept of variable. This is how you can declare and initialize the variables. This is for the current session.